So I'm in charge of the Indian River Lifesaving Station, if anybody's ever been there before. And then also any, hikes, walks, bonfires, fishing programs that we do at Delaware Seashore, Holt's Landing, and Fenwick. So if you ever have questions about, what's going on in the summer, what can I do while my family's here, hey, let me know. We've got tons of stuff going on. But today, we are going to be talking about the history of lifesaving in Delaware. Like I mentioned, I oversee the Indian River Lifesaving Station, which was part of the United States Lifesaving Service. Raise your hand if you've heard of lifesaving service before. Ooh, wow, this is going to be a knowledgeable group. All right, so I expect you to answer all the questions I have. No, I'm just kidding. But to understand the lifesaving service, we really have to go back a ways in time. We're going to start off, really in like the 1600s colonial era. So before the invention of the locomotive, and even after that in some places, like here, even into the 1900s, shipping was the fastest way of getting things around. Getting on the water was going to be faster than hoofing it somewhere, whether it's your own feet or on a horse or a mule or whatever. If you can put it on a boat and get it on a river or on the ocean, that's the best way for you to get your goods and services all around the place. Most ships stayed near shore. They navigated by using a technique called coasting, so they would stay within sight of shore and use local landmarks to basically navigate. Now, it's not like they couldn't go out into the ocean, right? We have sextants and all that good stuff from, way back in the day. But why do they want to stay closer to shore instead of heading out up and over? Any ideas?
Safety.
Safety? What do you mean by safety?
They could not swim.
Yeah, so a lot of sailors could not swim, right? So you do kind of want to be closer to shore if there's a big storm or something. That's part of it. Yeah. Any other ideas? Pirates? There was a history of piracy in this area, if you can believe it. Lewis back in the day was really the edge of civilization. If you wanted to fence some stolen stuff, Lewis was a good place to do it. So we had some pirates around this area, yeah. Honestly, they'd probably be closer to shore, staying inshore is probably going to be better about pirates. But it also just kind of comes down to some very human factors, right? It is quicker to get your goods and services to market if you stay close to shore. If you go out and up, back over, it's going to take a longer time. You're going to be out to sea longer, all that stuff. And these business expenses pile up. So they want to be closer to shore in case a storm comes up, yes. They want to be closer to shore because rescue comes to them more quickly, yes. But also it's just like that's kind of the easy business way to do it, right? If you want to get your stuff around, stay closer to shore instead of going all the way out and all that good stuff. So we have a lot of ships moving around. In this area, what are on those ships? What are we transporting around here?
Cotton.
So cotton would definitely be on ships moving past us, right? Probably coming from the south to different markets, Philadelphia, yeah, for sure.
Salt.
Yep, salt, yeah. We had big salt flats up at the Cape Henlopen area, the Gordon's Pond area, so that was a big one. Sure, what else?
Cedar.
Timber, yeah, there are a lot of timbering going on in the Back Bay. Two other big ones I think of. So again, yeah, sure, tobacco coming up from the south of us. We grew some tobacco here as well, so agricultural products writ large, that's a good one. There's two more I'm thinking of. What are a lot of ships doing out here today? Fishing, yeah, fishing is always a big one. And moving people, and I'm not just talking about like during the slave era, but also immigrants. We always think of Ellis Island as the big immigration point, but Philadelphia was a large immigration center as well. So you had a lot of ships, heading up the Delaware Bay. So all of these ships are out there off our coast, 16, 17, 18, even into the 1900s. What we also have off our coast, though, are a lot of shoals and sandbars, right? It's a very changeable area. We've got a pretty strong current. All the sand is constantly forming and reforming. So if you've got a lot of ships and you've got a lot of sandbars in the same area, what's that a recipe for? Shipwrecks, exactly right. Add to that the fact that most sailors couldn't swim, and you've got some real trouble, right? Even if they do survive the shipwreck, if they wind up in a place like this back in, the 1800s, nothing was built here. It's 14 miles to Lewis from the inlet, right? So you're going to die of exposure in the winter before you get up there, So all of these things were trouble for the maritime industry in this area. And it's not like these were unknown facts, right? There were attempts going back to just after we became a country, 1878, the Massachusetts Humane Society started creating what were called houses of refuge. And they were basically just these little shacks. And inside they would contain, blankets and food and fuel for a fire and that sort of thing. And the idea was, again, if you wrecked and you managed to make it to shore, instead of trying to crawl, 14 miles up to Lewis or whatever, you could go into one of these shacks and rehabilitate yourself and then make it to wherever you have to go. And it's better than nothing, right? But there are some issues. What are some issues you think we might have with these shacks?
Keeping them stocked and
People
filled.
staying there.
Oh, keeping them stocked, that's a big one, yep. So these structures were not manned or maintained throughout the year, so they were vulnerable to vandalism and theft. Folks in the area would be walking along and say, nobody's been in this shack for 18 months and I could sure use a coil of rope, so I'm just gonna yoink, take that, right? Or I could really use that axe that's stored here and yoink. And they would come back and all the stuff that was meant for the shipwreck mariners are gone. They were really only near busy ports of entry. There were lots of areas of coastline that were kind of left blank. And they didn't even have boats at these stations until 1807. So let's say you saw a shipwreck, right? It's like 1791 and you're standing there on the beach and you see a shipwreck happen. You can't even get out and help those folks because there are no boats there, right? So again, it's better than nothing, but it's not really doing what we need to do. The government eventually gets involved. In 1871, a man named Sumner Increase Kimball is appointed head of the Revenue Marine Bureau, and he had started out as a lawyer, and then he was a clerk for the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department operated what was called the Revenue Marine, and these were basically customs enforcers, right? Anti-pirating operations. Customs taxes were a big way for the early United States to generate money, right? And we had a lot of people smuggling, trying to evade those custom taxes. So the Revenue Marine, it was their job to go out there and make sure folks weren't, landing on the beach and offloading a whole bunch of goods that weren't getting taxed, right? And so he eventually is appointed head of the Revenue Marine Bureau, and the task of making sure we don't lose goods and boats and people so we can keep on getting cargo coming in, that basically falls to him in that position. So in 1871, he gets Congress to appropriate $200,000 to put in this new system, paying people actual professional lifesavers who would be paid during the storm season to man these essentially, what were at that point shacks, but would become life-saving stations. Does that make sense to everybody? Questions about anything I've mentioned so far? Feeling pretty good? Okay, all right. So again, 1871, we've got $200,000. We're going to start paying people to man places on the beach to actually try to help rescue folks, look for sailors and ships in distress, and go out and attempt rescues. And these guys, they were the surfmen of life-saving stations, life-saving crews, surfmen. They're kind of interchangeable words there. We were looking for local folks. So unlike the modern day Coast Guard where you join up and you might get sent to the Great Lakes, you might get sent out west, right? These were all local guys. They joined up at a local station and they stayed at that station. It wasn't like they would get mustered out to go anywhere else. Make sense? So they were mostly local guys, surfmen, watermen, farmers who knew the local area. They were familiar with the shoals, familiar with the tides, all those challenges that we had mentioned earlier. They also had to be physically able to go out on these rescues. We'll get into some of the challenges, the physical challenges that guys had to do, but right now it's enough to say that there was a physical, right? They had to meet physical requirements in order to get in. They were ranked in order of experience and capability, so the service wasn't militarized, right? We didn't have like captains, lieutenants, all that sort of thing. And what you did have was a keeper, he was number one, and then your surfmen were ranked 1 through 8 based on experience, and they had different roles, based on their rankings. Make sense? So the way they worked is the life-saving stations were built in areas where we thought wrecks were going to be likely at busy ports along exposed stretches of coast, that sort of thing. The keeper, he's kind of like the captain of the ship. He's the man in charge. So he's going to be at your life-saving station all year round to make sure those ropes and axes and fuel, make sure that doesn't disappear, right? The other surfmen, the 6 to 8 surfmen who would make up your team, they were only there seasonally. Typically September, October through April, May, depending on what the weather was like that year. Why are they only there in the winter? Any guesses? Yeah, so there are more storms during the winter, right? So there's that, more chance of shipwrecks, more chance of people dying of exposure if they did make it to the beach during the winter. And also, the government didn't want to pay them for the whole year, right? And they only had the $200,000. So they had to say, well, this is the chance that, the chances are highest that wrecks are going to happen at this point in the year. So that's when they put them there. Make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. So 6 to 8 surfmen living with a keeper. The keeper was there all year. The surfmen are only there during the winter storm season, which was typically September, October through March, April, May, something like that. Makes sense? Okay, great. So what are their duties? They lived in this station, and probably their biggest duty was going on patrol. So they had patrol from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., 8 p.m. to 12 p.m., 12 p.m. to 4 p.m., and 4 a.m. and 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., basically covering the nighttime. They would also post 24-hour patrols during bad weather. So during your patrol, 2 men would head out. 1 man would head out north, and 1 man would head out south. And they'd be walking up and down the beach, looking for ships in distress, looking for cargo strewn about, looking for sailors on the beach so they could render assistance. They would walk for about 2 hours, usually about 2.5 miles one way, and they'd meet the surfmen coming in the opposite direction from the other station. And then they would make sure, hey, did you see anything? Anybody need help? No, you're good, okay. They'd head back to their stations, right? When they get back there, it's about 4 hours, another set of 2 go out, and they keep on with these patrols. Does that make sense to everybody?
Day and night?
So it was typically, like I said, started at 4 p.m., goes to about 8 a.m., but if it was bad weather, stormy weather, they would do it 24 hours. Yeah. Any other questions so far? Yes.
So was their only communication meeting each other halfway?
So when it first started out, yes. When the service first started out here in Delaware, yeah. Eventually, though, they get a telegraph and then they get a telephone. We're still doing some research, but we believe the telephone line that linked to the different life-saving stations in Delaware was the second line put in the state. We think the governor got the first one and the surfman got the second one. Still doing some research to try to verify it, but it shows you, how important this was and how important they saw the spread of information going between these stations. Yeah. So let's say you're out on the beach, you're in the middle of your patrol, and you see a ship in distress. Right, a ship maybe has hit a sandbar. How are you going to communicate that back to your station so you can start getting out and doing your job?
With your lights?
Lights, yeah. So you would have a storm lantern, and maybe you could flash that back at the station. But really what they would use, oops, I went past myself, is the Cosden flare here. Yes, the Cosden flare was developed by a guy with the incredible name of Benjamin Franklin Cosden. With a name like that, how could he not be an inventor, right?
Right.
He worked for the Navy, mostly doing work with chemicals, and eventually, unfortunately, these chemicals poisoned him. And he died in the middle of the 1800s, leaving behind a wife, Martha, and 4 kids. And so Martha was kind of in trouble, right? In the middle of the 1800s, there weren't a whole lot of opportunities for women entrepreneurs, but she did something rather unusual. She compiled all of her husband's work together and put it in this marketable form here, the Cosden Flare, and then she went on a multi-country tour selling it. She went all throughout Europe, all throughout the United States, selling it to various governments. She sold it to the Navy. By the end of the life-saving service history, every single life-saving station was equipped with a Cosden Flare, which is pretty cool. We're not able to talk about women too much in the service because it was restricted to only men, but Martha Cosden is a lady who really comes in and makes a big difference. So I always like to plug her, in the program where we can. So you would burn that off. You could burn that off to signal to the ship, hey, we see you, we're coming to help you. If a ship was getting close to an area where you knew shoals were, you could burn off a different combination of lights to say, hey, maybe just back away, and that would actually prevent the wreck, which is, the best possible circumstance. And of course, you could burn it off to summon the rest of the folks down to help you out. I did skip over something though. So as I said, that was bad. Well, forgive that formatting there. Sorry, everybody. But if they were, out walking around at, 2 a.m., October, it's a nice night out there, it's not really stormy. I don't know about you, but I might be tempted to take a little nap out there in the dunes. But this is a federal job, right? You can't be napping on the job. So that's where the checks and clocks come in. And they're both basically timekeeping tools. So the check is a little badge about the size of your palm, right? And each station, each surfman would have it. It would have their district, station, and surfman number on there. And so you would go on your walk, you'd walk your 2.5 miles north and you'd meet the guy coming south and you would exchange checks. And then you would walk back to your station, you would present that check to the keeper and say, see, look, it's got different numbers on it. Clearly I was out there doing my job. That works great if we're at Indian River and we're heading up north, right? No problem to meet the guy coming south from Rehoboth. What happens if we're heading south? Can we meet the person coming from Bethany? Why not? The inlet's in the way. Yeah, the inlet's in the way. We can't meet them. So instead, we've got the patrol clock. The patrol clock was a big clock in a leather-bound satchel, and you'd wear it kind of like a purse. And you'd take that down on your patrol, and you'd hike down to the inlet, and you'd come into contact with something called a key box. And in the key box, what do you think was in there? A key, that's right. And you'd put it in that clock, and you'd wind it, and it would stamp a little piece of paper in there with the time. And you would head back up to the keeper and you'd show him your little piece of paper and say, see, I wasn't sleeping in the dunes. So even back then, the government had a way of keeping an eye on you, right? But you weren't sleeping, you were on patrol, you saw a ship in distress, so you lit off your Cosden flare, right? That's going to alert everybody back at the station to start getting ready. Yes?
I don't know if you've ever noticed that north of the inlet, there's Key Box Road.
There
Back
is.
in the 60s was a camping area.
Yep.
But it got its name because that's where the Key Box was for them coming up from the south and going south.
Absolutely. Yeah, key boxes were not, unique to the Lifesaving Service. They're still used in some places, like for factories, like folks guarding factories will walk from key box to check themselves in. So yeah, absolutely. It's pretty fun that that's in there. It was the key box for the station, but like you said, it's got the same history. So in the life-saving station, we see the Cosden flare is burnt and we start reacting. If the ship is further offshore, we're going to use our surf boat. The surf boat was about 26 feet long, about 1,000 pounds, usually cedar and oak, and they were self-bailing, so water would splash in and go right back out, so you don't have to worry about sinking, right? It would take the whole crew to use. There was no rudder on the back because you were launching it directly from the beach, so the keeper would have to stand in the back with a sweep oar, and that's how he would steer, and everybody would sit facing him, and they would row backwards. So you needed the whole crew to operate one of these things. But you could row out to the ship, you could pile up to 15 passengers in there at once, and then you'd row them on back. And this works, pretty well for most of our ships because we have, these trading and fishing ships with 6, 8, 10 people on board, So usually we can accomplish this in one trip. But what if we've got one of those like big immigrant ships going up to Philadelphia? Then what are we gonna do? What do we think?
Maybe 2 trips?
Yeah, make as many trips as you need to, right? So you would go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until you got everybody off of that ship. Right? So pretty remarkable stuff these guys are doing. And it's not like they're doing it on a nice day like today. If there's a shipwreck, what's the weather probably going to be like? Yeah, bad. You're going out in the worst possible situation. So pretty amazing to think what these guys had to do. Questions about anything I've mentioned so far? Yes?
Are those do they have life jackets on?
Yeah, so right there they're wearing cork vests. So this was before the personal flotation devices that we have today, but they took these blocks of cork and would sew them into canvas vests and sometimes canvas belts, and that would give themselves a little bit of buoyancy.
How is it self-bailing?
Yes, so you can't really see on these guys, but they have these scupper holes in there, so the water will crash over and then drain right back out the scupper hole. Yeah. Yeah, like I said, these things weigh 1,000 pounds, and sometimes they had horses to take them out, and sometimes they didn't. So imagine, you've got a wreck that's 2 miles away. You got to put yourself in the traces, drag 1,000 pounds of boat down the beach, and then start your rescue. Pretty remarkable. Yeah. If the ship was closer inshore, though, they could use the beach apparatus. And the beach apparatus is very complicated. We've got this picture. It's got a bunch of different parts. But you could use this for wrecks that were closer to shore, maybe, 100 yards out or something like that is typically about the range for the beach apparatus. You need a whole bunch of different pieces in here. That gets carried in the beach cart. So altogether, the beach cart, again, about 1,500 pounds that you are pulling by hand down the beach. I get tired just thinking of carrying my coolers over the beach. Forget about this thing. That's really, really incredible.
So they push and they pull.
They push and they pull, exactly, yep. So the most important part of your beach apparatus is the Lyle gun, and we like to say it's the only gun designed to save lives and not take them because it was developed specifically for the service by this guy, David Lyle. Bronze, 186 pounds, and you would load it up with a projectile, and you could tie up a what's called the shot line to that projectile. And you'd fire that off, and where are you firing it? To the ship?
Close to the ship.
Over the ship, right? We don't want to hit the ship and make a bad situation worse. The idea is to throw that line over the ship and they can grab onto that. And then basically by rigging up more lines, you can put together this breeches buoy, right? It's like a big long clothesline, right? Big long pulley system. And it's called a breeches buoy because it's a pair of pants or breeches attached to a flotation device or buoy. So when you've got the whole thing set up, you can pull on the line, right? Your surfman will pull on the line, it'll send the breeches buoy out to the ship. A sailor will jump in one of those things, and they can pull on the line to take them off the ship. And hopefully only their tiny little toes get wet there, right? So the surfmen don't have to go out, right? These guys don't have to get in the surf boat, and everybody remains safe. Again, pretty good for most of the ships that we have here. We've got 6, 8 people on board. You only have to do this maybe 6 times. But again, if you've got one of those really big immigrant ships, then you gotta break out the life car. The life car was this big metal contraption, right? And you could cram 4 or 5 people in there at once. And this was what you would use if you had those real big ships. You'd still set up the breeches buoy like normal with all those ropes and pulleys and everything, but you'd run out the life car instead of the breeches buoy. 5 people would cram themselves in there and they would get locked inside, right? Locked inside and then pulled off the ship back to the beach. Had about 4 minutes of air in there. Nobody liked the life car. Nobody liked the life car, right? People didn't like getting rescued in it because they felt like they were going to drown, they were going to asphyxiate, very scary. And the surfmen didn't like it because it weighed 500 pounds. It was an extra 500 pounds they had to pull out with their beach carriage, right? But again, if it's the choice between drowning and using the life car, I'd probably hop in that thing too. Yeah. Questions about any of this sort of thing so far?
Did they have one of those in Indian River?
Yes, yes they did. Mm-hmm.
So it was locked, was it locked from the outside or the inside? Like,
Locked from the outside.
so if the rope broke or something and it fell in, you couldn't get out?
So it had flotations,
Okay.
right? So hopefully somebody would be able to get out there, but in 4 minutes in bad weather.
Say 4 minutes.
Now, I don't know of any fatal incidents with the life car, like off the top of my head, anywhere in the service. I'm not saying it didn't happen. Very scary, sounds real bad. I wouldn't want to get in it, but from what I understand, every time they used it, it worked. Again, don't quote me on that. There are lots of different life-saving stations, but I haven't heard of any fatal incidents with the life car. Yeah. All right.
One question.
Yes.
What was the thing that they used to keep the rope from getting tangled as it's being shot?
Sure.
It's
So-
like the thing with a lot of.
It looks like a box with a whole bunch of spikes in it. It's called a faking box. And you would fake the line along those spikes so when you fired it out with that projectile, it wouldn't get all knotted up. If you're interested in that, come on up to the Indian River Lifesaving Station. Not only do we have one, but we also do Lyle gun firings during the summer. Super duper cool. So pay attention for that. Yeah. So it's a difficult job, right? They are basically away from their families during the winter season. These guys didn't get paid a lot. The average was $10 a week, $40 a month, which was basically what an unskilled laborer got paid in that day and age. And the fact that this was considered unskilled labor is pretty remarkable to me. But why do the job? Sounds pretty rough. What do we think?
Better than no job at all.
So that's part of it, right? Like I said, most of these guys were local fishermen, watermen, farmers. You growing a lot of food during the winter?
No.
Not necessarily doing a ton of crabbing during the winter, right? So this was a way to get paid in a time when you otherwise wouldn't be making money. So that's a big one. Any other ideas?
Were they heroes?
Yes, they were. So in a time before, movie stars and sports heroes, these were some of the first major figures in our cultural memory, right? These guys were going out there doing a difficult job, putting their lives on the line to save other people. It's kind of the way we think of like volunteer firefighters today, right? But to a larger extent back then. And so you really had a good reputation. These guys were thought of very highly, the lifesavers. So this was a good way to kind of get your name out there, burnish up your image. Or your family's image, going into the service. And then, of course, there are just people who are altruistic, that want to save lives. But those 3 are the big reasons that people got into the service. Any other questions? Still feeling good? Okay, all right. Let's dive into some of these actual stations. We had 6 total in Delaware. So we began 1876, about 5 years after the service was funded with that $200,000 from Sumner Increase Kimball. Everybody remember, that's when we got our first station, Cape Henlopen Lifesaving Station. It was on the Great Dune. Are people familiar with the Great Dune? So if you go to Cape Henlopen State Park, there is a massive dune that goes down like the whole middle of the park. It's hard to tell sometimes because you're actually on it and driving on it. But it's a big feature, and that is where this station was located. It had what was called an 1875 design, just means it was drawn up in 1875. They could have given it a cooler name, but that's the way it is. However, it was heavily modified. So they have a whole bunch of different outbuildings and things like that. It seems like they probably had some outbuildings for the folks, the family members of the folks who were working there. Again, like Indian River was not able to accommodate that, but this place was heavily modified for some additional uses. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by erosion in 1939, 1940. You can see a picture, there it is. Right, the drift, the ocean current, the natural, drift just took the sand out from underneath it and it broke right in half. So
Where
it
was
no
it?
longer exists.
Where was it in compared to the lighthouse?
So it was similarly placed to the lighthouse, yeah. If you have an idea of where that's located. Yeah. Cape Henlopen, they jumped right into action. You can see here we have the Moses Day wrecked, just a year after it was built. So they were out there, getting to work. What is really funny though is I also found this article from 1886, and it says down here, this is the first rescue the crews of the station near Cape Henlopen have made, which is just completely not true. Right? So, even with some of these historical sources, you really got to go back and double check their work because they were just writing anything sometimes. Right? But Cape Henlopen, they were getting to work, basically from day one. They were located there because you had a lot of ships, like I said, coming into the Delaware Bay, and they would get in trouble on those shoals. So it makes sense that was kind of the first place that they built. Moving down the line, Indian River Lifesaving Station. So this is where I work. It is one of the few that you can go into because we've restored it as a museum. It was also built in 1876. It was originally about 100 yards closer to the water than it is today. So if you come visit, just imagine about 100 yards further to the east. But within a year or two, we had dunes building up around it. Water was coming in during high tides. Luckily though, these 1875 designs, they don't have any sort of basement or foundation. So they just lifted it up and log rolled it to its modern position in 1878, and it's been sitting there ever since. So it's basically in its original location, which makes it pretty unique. Most of these have been removed or moved or destroyed. You can still visit it. It is a museum, like I said, open year round, and we do lots of different programs there. And you can do a self-guided tour, which is pretty cool. See that fading box if you'd like. Indian River Lifesaving Station was very remote. So we didn't have the ability to support family members. At most times we didn't even have the ability to support horses. But we were blessed with a keeper named Keeper Washington Vickers. He was there for 24 years out of the 39 years that this place existed. And he really exemplified what it meant to be a surfman, as you can kind of see in these two, which we'll go into a little bit more. So Vickers was born in Delaware, 1842 in the Seaford area, and when the Civil War breaks out, he actually joins the Confederacy and he fights the Battle of Gettysburg. He's wounded in the arm, but he evades capture and makes it back to Confederate lines. And they say, hey, your arm is too wounded to carry a rifle anymore, so we're going to train you up as a nurse. And he worked in a field hospital for the rest of the war. And when the war ended, most Confederate soldiers, including Vickers, were given an amnesty, and he took it and came back to work in the Delmarva area, trying to start a farm, it seems like. He joins the Lifesaving Service at Assateague, and within 5 years rises from surfman number 8 all the way up to keeper, which is pretty impressive. And he is appointed the keeper at Station Indian River. There are a lot of reports of surfmen not getting along with their keepers. Like I said, the keeper was kind of the captain of the ship. He was responsible for reports, enforcing the rules, shifts, all that sort of thing. So there are some reports of keepers sleeping with pistols underneath their pillows. But Keeper Vickers did not have that problem. He didn't ask his men to do anything that he wouldn't do, as exemplified by these two right here. So March 1888, big blizzard of 1888. There were 27 shipwrecks in the Lewis Harbor within 3 days. So the life-saving crews were at work, right? The Providence had gotten trapped by sea ice, and so the Cape Henlopen and Lewis crews, they couldn't row out to it. They couldn't shoot their breeches buoy out to it. So what they decided to do was get the boat onto the ice and pole it across the ice sheet out to the boat, right? So they pole it out there, and by the time they get out there, ice and snow is building up behind them. They pull all the sailors off, but now they can't pull their way back. They're exhausted, too much is built up behind them. But thankfully, we had telegraphed down to the Indian River Lifesaving Station a little earlier in the day saying, hey, I think, we're gonna need some help. So Keeper Vickers takes 2 surfmen with him, and he walks 14 miles up to Lewis. Again, there was no road back then, so how did he walk up there? On the beach, yep, through the sand and the snow. So 14 miles up to Lewis. He gets up there, he sees what's going on, says, okay, we're gonna need more than the 3 of us. And he wrestles up a bunch of guys from the Navy hospital over there, the Marine hospital, and they are able to pull on a line to get that ship back over here, to get that surf boat back across the ice. So they rescue both of the life-saving crews and the crew aboard the Providence. They have a cup of coffee, and then they walk 14 miles back to Indian River Life-Saving Station because they have to do their own patrol. Pretty amazing. Yeah. Another one, 1902, so just a little bit later, Vickers is still here. There's a ship that's stranded on a shoal and they're going to fire the breeches buoy over, but the crew isn't convinced that the breeches buoy is safe. So 60-year-old Keeper Vickers gets in the buoy, has himself hauled out to the ship, and hauled back to prove that it still works. And then they manage to rescue everybody off of there. So, really kind of the consummate keeper, again, putting himself in positions that, he would only ask the crew to do if he would do it himself. He stayed at Indian River until 1907, and then he moved down to Bethany Beach, quit the service in 1915, and died in 1930 and is buried in the Georgetown area. You can still see his grave if you are interested. But really just kind of the consummate surfman, right? The consummate keeper. So we were lucky to have him at a station so remote like Indian River. Yeah. Questions about him or anything else so far?
Were there any stations on the bay north of Lewis?
Yes, absolutely, and we will be rolling on to them in just a sec, but first we got to deal with Rehoboth Beach. So Rehoboth Beach was next up, 1878, so just a couple years after Cape Henlopen and Indian River. End of Dagsworthy Street in Dewey, so Dewey didn't exist back then, right, but today, because of the way everything is split up, it would technically be Dewey, even though it was the Rehoboth Beach Station. 1876 design, they were coming up with new designs like every year. I don't know why. They were never happy with their design and they kept on fiddling with them. The building still exists, however, it is a private home in Lewis. So, somebody is actually living in it. Like I said, these things didn't have foundations or basements, so when they were done with it as a life-saving station, they just picked the whole thing up and, relocated it into town, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly where because the person has had trouble with people like just coming up to their house and stuff like that. But there's a picture, you can drive around and figure it out for yourself. Right? It's definitely out there and it's cool to see. Rehoboth Beach, unfortunately, kind of a little bit unlucky in my opinion. So I don't know how well you can read these, but 1891 we've got John Hurdle. He was laid off for a full year after injuring himself in the service. So pretty nasty injury that he was out all year. And then in 1912, we get a double whammy. William Turner, they were practicing using the surf boat. So twice a week they had to go out and spend 30 minutes at the oars, and then they would capsize their boat intentionally and rewrite it as part of their training, so they were ready when they went out on rescues. And as part of this training, he got an oar to the head. Yeah, oar to the head. And if you read here, it says that Dr. C.B. of Lewis removed several small particles of fractured bone from the wound. So it's not just like he gashed himself in the head, right? He split his cranium open there. And that was just at practice. Yeah, just at practice. Unfortunately, that same year, Captain Thomas Steele, who was the keeper of that station, also passed away. So they had some hardship over at the Rehoboth Beach Station, unfortunately. But there were lighter times. In 1910, I found this article that says there was a crew of, I don't know what you want to call them, playboys, I guess, in the area. And they were driving one of those newfangled automobiles around the beach. And they stopped off at the Rehoboth Beach Station. They were just kind of seeing what was going on. And then all of a sudden they realized that they had parked in some pretty wet sand, and the car had sunk all the way up to its axle, so they couldn't get it out of there. So you'll read that Captain Steele actually called his surfmen out to raise the car up and get it back on the road. It says in here that, their hopes that they could use the beach as a speedway were dashed, which is, I think, pretty funny. So, even though some of these places were way out in the boonies, sometimes you still had some of these moments of levity, especially in some of the more urban ones. Being called out to rescue a car is pretty funny, in my opinion. So you were asking about on the Bayside. Here we go. We've got the Lewis Life-Saving Station. This was the only one on the Bayside, really the only one past Cape Henlopen. which is kind of interesting. I guess they figured once they got into the river itself, they were going to be pretty much okay. But this one was built in 1884. It was near the modern ferry terminal. Everybody know where the ferry terminal is located. So that's basically where this guy was. It was comparatively urban. And the building still exists as the Rehoboth VFW. So again, they picked it up and moved it, and the VFW uses it now. So if you go to any events there, you're in the Lewis Lifesaving Station. Because they were kind of urban and in a calmer, more sheltered area, they were also able to have a boathouse with rails. So they got to launch their ship right out of the boathouse on the rails into the water, right? None of this lugging it 2 miles down the beach or anything like that. So they had it pretty good here. The boathouse is now managed by the Lewis Historical Society, and they've got it open for tours again. So if you want to check that out, I definitely recommend it next time you're in the Lewis area. Being an urban station, they had some pretty funny urban problems. All of these come from 1908, wacky year for the Lewis Lifesaving Station. But 2 women were horseback riding for some reason during the winter, and they got stuck in a snowbank, and the lifesavers had to go out and rescue them. The article says it's the first aid to the injured without getting wet that they've ever had to do. They had to go out into the water, which I think is pretty funny.
Saw that.
Yep. It also is on, it says something red was waved, but the surfmen don't want to talk about it, which, again, just talks like the funny kind of Puritan mindset back in the day. Like, oh, they waved a handkerchief and they're like embarrassed to say it. It just strikes me as funny. Somebody tried to set fire to the granary in Lewis. However, luckily one of the surfmen was on his 4-hour patrol and managed to put it out and then alert the authorities. So good for the surfmen. And then here's my favorite one. So there were some sailors on a ship that was docked in the Breakwater Harbor, and they felt like they were being woken up too early, and they didn't want to do their work anymore. And they said, it's mutiny, we're going to overthrow the captain. And the captain ran up some signals saying ship in distress, right? Like we're taking on water. Not true, but the surfmen came out there to say, hey, what's going on? And the captain said, beat these guys up for me. And they basically suppressed the mutiny, right? They chain ganged them back into service on the ship. So again, you might get caught into all sorts of stuff when you're in one of these more urban centers here. Questions about any of these stations so far? We got a couple more to go through, but I'm moving pretty fast, so I just want to check in. Still feeling good. All right. Fenwick Island, I think this is where you said you had some connection.
My grandfather.
Yes, so Fenwick Island, 1891, built near the Fenwick Island Lighthouse, if folks know where that is. See, another design already, 1882. I don't know what they're doing, but that's the kind of design we have here. It was sold in 1957 and eventually demolished, so unfortunately there is no trace of that one left, which is too bad. Fenwick Island had a lot of breeches buoy rescues. I guess just because of the way the shoals were out there, lots of ships stranded pretty close to shore. So they really kind of became experts at those breeches buoy rescues. You can see here, we've got 35 trips with the breeches buoy to bring people off one of those ships. I guess they didn't have a life car with them at that point. But again, you just do this until everybody's rescued, pretty amazing. And then in 1911, they've got another one. They're taking 8 guys off a ship by breeches buoy. So pretty much our breeches buoy experts in this area. Something else I thought was really funny. These guys were apparently offended that some of the newspapers were implying that they were taking break, and they had to issue their own statement. The men employed at Fenwick Island Lifesaving Station object to the statements made in some of the papers that they are now on their vacation. The truth of the matter was that 2 of the crew were on shore for a few days' leave of absence. So, again, these guys were pretty concerned with their reputation, making sure people know, hey, we're still out there, we're still rescuing folks. Just funny to me. Shows you what was going on in Sussex County back in 1896. Yeah.
My aunt, I told you my aunt was born in one of those little cottages.
Yes, yeah, so most of the stations, aside from Indian River, had those little cottages that supported families. But because Indian River was just so out of the way, not a lot of food or water or farming area, unfortunately they didn't get any family relations. Yeah. And then we've got Bethany Beach Lifesaving Station, the last, built in 1907, near the corner of 5th and Atlantic. Are people familiar with the National Guard area there, where the big helicopter is? Yeah. Basically across the street. That's where this thing would have been. Yeah.
It's still there.
This guy is not still there, unfortunately. No? Yeah, so it was demolished. But they do have some old style buildings that kind of look similar. Again, it's got this Duluth style, called because it was first put into place in Duluth. I don't know why. But they did have life-saving stations around the Great Lakes, so they were developing designs out there. It has this kind of cool tower, which is a pretty notable feature of the design. The rest of them usually just have a platform kind of on the roof, so it looked pretty cool. I do wish it was still around. It cost $10,000 in 1907, equivalent to $320,000 today. And again, we had 6 of these stations, so the government really was investing in this service. Like I said, it is demolished, so unfortunately you can't see it. They were a little too late on the scene to really do too much as a life-saving station, but they were pretty busy in the Coast Guard era. Mostly, they were doing rescues. They pulled this lady out of the water here, Miss Myrtle Hall. They pulled her out of the water and did resuscitations on her for a while. But resuscitations back in 1917, extremely crude, right? Modern CPR wasn't invented until like the 60s. So probably what they did was put her on her back and just lifted and lowered her arms for like an hour. So miraculously, she came back to life because that doesn't really do anything. But I'm happy to give them the credit. I'm happy to give them the credit on that one. They also were really involved in like anti-smuggling operations, right? What goes on around the 1920s? Prohibition, yeah. But again, these are pretty undeveloped stretches of coast, and we had a lot of bootleggers who were landing booze here and taking them to other areas. So these guys were on patrol for that as part of the Coast Guard. Yeah. So see, this station, the Bethany Beach station, netted $26,000 in liquor after they raided a chicken house. Unfortunately, they were not able to catch the smugglers, but they had hid it in a chicken house. These guys were tipped off and raided the chicken house.
And that farmhouse is still there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So they did really kind of get into the action as kind of the Coast Guard, doing that rum busting, which is a funny little postscript to them. Yeah. But that does kind of bring us to the end of the life-saving service. So established, 1871. In 1915, however, it was combined with the Revenue Cutter Service, those guys out there enforcing the marine taxes, basically, to create the modern Coast Guard. The thought was at the time we have too many services that are basically doing the same thing, and it would make sense to just put them together into one agency, get rid of that redundancy, make management easier. So that's basically why this was done here. Not much changed on the ground for these guys. Most surfmen just became Coast Guardsmen, and basically all life-saving stations just became Coast Guard stations. The Indian River Life-Saving Station was used as a Coast Guard station all the way up until 1962, for instance. So not a whole lot changed on the ground. They were still out there rescuing folks, doing all that good stuff. They were just doing it under a different name at this point. Makes sense to everybody?
Yeah. Did they get more pay?
As Coast Guardsmen? Not initially, no, but yes, eventually they were getting paid better as Coast Guardsmen than they would have been as surfmen, yes. So a couple, statistics to round this out. 39 years here in Delaware, from when the first station was built in 1876 to when it becomes the Coast Guard in 1915. Like I said, 6 stations. We know that they responded to at least 301 wrecks. The Life-Saving Service put out reports every year detailing, what had been saved and where, and we have all of them except for 3. That's why I'm saying at least 301 wrecks. I went through and I counted every single time a station in Delaware responded based on those reports. So at least 301 times these guys went out, to take people off ships to do those rescues. They saved at least 1,000 people, so when we're talking about that surf boat, when we're talking about that breeches buoy, we're not talking about it just theoretically. They actually brought people off ships and saved lives using those techniques. Yeah. And these are all guys who, like I said, they got paid basically the unskilled laborer wage. They were away from their families for a long time, doing hard labor. The unofficial motto of the Life-Saving Service was, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. So it's really amazing that any of these guys signed up and did their jobs, and we are indebted to them. Everybody here is indebted to the job that they did. With that being said, any questions?
Yes. Were any lost?
Yes, so none in Delaware were lost in the line of duty. Which I think is a little bit of nonsense, to be honest with you, because we do know some guys who got sick on duty and then died. I consider that being a duty loss, but the government did not. Throughout the country, however, like I said, this was on both coasts, around the Great Lakes, even out into Alaska. We know of several folks who died on rescue. There are several occasions where they went out in a surf boat, the boat capsized, and everybody was lost. People were even lost on beach patrol. We know of a couple guys who got hit by lightning, a couple guys who got washed away by, sneak waves, somebody who had a heart attack on patrol. So it was not an easy job, and yes, people did lose their lives. Yeah.
Can I show you my grandfather?
Yes, absolutely.
This is that right here.
That's incredible. Yep. So this is that Fenwick crew. This is a great picture of them all, kind of palling around, right? Like I said, we were lucky in these areas. We didn't have the kind of like the butting heads amongst keepers and crew members that they saw, especially out around the Great Lakes. I don't know why out there. I think it was because they were mostly recruiting like timbermen who didn't like to be told what to do and didn't really have that much maritime heritage to begin with, as opposed to out here, it was a little easier. But you can see, they all enjoy each other. And you need that if you're going to be spending 6-8 months, kind of in an isolated building doing rescues. Yeah.
Just a comment about the more recent history of the Indian River Inlet Life Station. You had mentioned that the Coast Guard abandoned it in '62. That was because of the '62 storm, and that's when they built their new Coast Guard station in the inlet itself. But for years after that, it was just used as a compound for Delaware Department of Transportation to park trucks.
Right.
Yep.
And so it was that way for many years, and then somewhere along the line, the state park decided to, restore it and, reseed it as it is today.
Yeah, there's some leftovers from the highway administration there. Like if you show up, we have a pole barn, and everybody says, "Oh, is that the stables where the horses live?" No, that was built in the '60s for the highway administration. I'm sorry to break your heart on that one. But yeah, it was used basically as a staging area. And then in the '90s, the Delaware Seashore Preservation Foundation, they were the ones who really started the drive to restore the place. And now it's administered by us at Delaware Seashore State Park. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
The colors of the station, are they the original colors?
So we have restored the station back to its 1901 appearance. These stations had different color schemes depending on what time period in the life of the service we're talking about. So in 1901, they were painted those colors. Let's see, I think I got a good picture of it on the next slide, right there. If we were to match them to the modern Sherwin-Williams colors, they would be cranberry red and pumpkin seed orange. So kind of like Thanksgiving on a building is what I like to say. But again, it helped with that coasting, right? They could see, oh, that's that garishly colored building. We know that's the Lifesaving station. We kind of know where we are. And we know that's where we need to go if we get help. But again, at different times, they had different color schemes.
And they didn't pick, go ahead.
Did the design come out of Washington or?
Yes. So they, like I said, they kept developing these different designs. They would test new designs in new places, but it was drafted up basically in Washington, and then they would like build it in Duluth or whatever and see how it worked, and if it worked, they'd bring it around. They had dozens of designs. Like I said, they never seemed to stop designing places up until it turned into the Coast Guard. They never seemed to be happy with it. Yeah.
So they didn't paint them different colors, like lighthouses are painted different colors, so you could see it and know exactly where you were.
They did at different points in the service.
Okay.
So, like in the 1901 era, they were painting them different colors. So this one would be different from the Rehoboth one, that would be different from the Lewis one. But at the beginning of the service, they were all supposed to be brown. As we get later on, it's supposed to be like green and white, and then we get into kind of the more like white and red that we know from the Coast Guard. So again, it just depends on what era we're talking about. Anybody else? Yeah.
What kind of artifacts do you have at the Lifesaving Station?
Yes, so we have a bunch of different artifacts dating from the time period and from life-saving stations, but there's only one artifact in the entire building that we can say comes from the Indian River Life-Saving Station. It's actually a piano. So one of the surfmen must have been bored out of his gourd because he hired a mule team to drag a piano down the beach from Lewis so he could play the piano down there. And then he became a guardsman, and his son became a guardsman, and the son took the piano with him all around, and it went to the son's daughter, and she eventually came back to Lewis in the 90s when the place was being restored. She heard about it and donated it to us. So that's the one thing we can conclusively say came from our station. But we have a whole beach apparatus set up. We have a surfboat in there you can check out. Lanterns, patrol clocks, patrol checks, costume flare handles. We have a Milton Bradley Lifesavers board game, which is incredible to see. People would pretend to be these guys in their off time. Like I said, again, they were some of our first, cultural heroes. And you can tour the station. Like I said, we've restored it to 1901, and so you can go through, and we've got like a little audio tour that you can do as well to learn about all the different artifacts in there. Yeah.
And when you said it was open year round, but
What hours?
Yes, it depends on the time of year. So right now we are open Tuesday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. and Saturday 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. As we get closer to the summer, our hours will expand until eventually we're going to be open 9 to 4, 7 days a week. And then again, that starts cutting down on the other side of summer. But if you go to destateparks.com, you can find our hours, you can find all the programs we do. Like I said, we do, crabbing, hiking, we fire off the Lyle gun, which is super duper cool, lantern tours of the station, all that sort of stuff's on the website as well. Yeah.
Do you do any school tours there, and what ages?
Big time.
Start?
Yeah, so we've got lots of school programs, mostly on tours of the station, but we also do environmental education. Like we do a lot of squid dissections with school groups, which is pretty cool. Owl pellet dissections, both very cool, and all ages. I mean, we have homeschool groups that have little toddlers, all the way up to we do high school groups for some of the more intense history tours. Yeah.
You were saying you did demonstrations of
Yes.
the wild gun and things like that?
Yes.
Are they done every day or
No.
is it a certain schedule?
Yes, and that schedule is not out yet. It'll probably go out late April, early May. Typically during the summer, what we do is like a blank firing of the wild gun once a week. So we fill it with a little bit of black powder, no projectile or anything like that, and show you how it goes boom, which is cool enough by itself, let me tell you. But then usually once a month during the summer, we actually do the whole breeches buoy apparatus. So we put the projectile in there, we fire it off, we rig up the breeches buoy, and we actually take somebody down off what's called the wreck pole. So that is kind of our premier event. If there's one you're going to see, keep an eye out for that one. It's super duper cool.
Is that schedule online?
You will be able to find it online. It's not scheduled yet. Look for it, coming out late April, early May. Absolutely. Yeah.
And how many yards offshore would that be for the breeches buoy?
So the breeches buoy would typically be used if something was about 100 yards offshore. It had a maximum range of about 400 yards, but with the weather conditions, it was often much less than that. So 400, with a wing and a prayer, but really 100 is where they would be comfortable using it.
So, coming back to the breeches buoy, would they tie that off to the mast on the ship?
Correct. Yep.
And then they have that frame on the short of them,
Yep. Here, let's see if we can go back a little bit and take a look at it. Kind of hard to see just because there are so many pieces to it, you know what I mean? But they would shoot out the rope, and the instructions on there would say, tie this off to your mast, and if the mast is gone, so imagine that, you could be in a shipwreck where you're in that much, dire need, just tie it off to the strongest possible point. And so you've got it tied off to the ship here. I'm sorry, I'm going to move. You've got it tied off to the ship over here. The line comes back. You've buried what's called the sand anchor, like 5 or 10 feet down, because that's what's going to anchor the whole thing in place. And then you raise what's called the crotch. The crotch is 2 pieces of wood. It's called that because it looks like a pair of legs. And that's what gives you the tension between the 2 points. And then you can rig up your lines in your breeches buoy so that when you pull on the line, it works like a big, laundry line, essentially, a big pulley.
Was these life-saving stations uniquely American, or did we borrow any technology from the Europeans?
Yes, they did have them in Europe as well. Most of what we borrowed comes in the form of the lifeboat, the surf boat. So they were the first people to start those designs. The American, houses of refuge originally used the British designs, and then eventually we tinkered with them to create, indigenous designs.
We have a display over at the museum across the street, because that was my grandfather's house. So we have a little display we have a Lyle gun, we have a couple of other.
It's really cool. They're really cool. Like I said, the only gun designed to save lives and not take them. So it's pretty nifty to see. Well, thank you so much for coming out, everybody. If you do have further questions, I'll be here for probably another 5 minutes, just kind of hanging out. But I hope you appreciate, what these guys were doing here, the difficult conditions they were working under, and how much they did really give to the maritime industry in this place. And I hope to see some of you up at the Lifesaving Station this summer.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much.